The idea of heaven is a popular notion. According to a 2015 survey, 72% of all Americans believe in a place where people who have led good lives are eternally rewarded. But what will heaven be like? Sitting on clouds, playing a harp, or other popular depictions disagree with the biblical model. At the end of his apocalypse, John describes the eternal state as a new heaven and a new earth with a new Jerusalem as its capital. This paper will explore the theological implications of all these new things in Revelation 21, verses 1 to 5. What we'll see is that heaven is not some ethereal dream world at all, but a physical, future reality for the people of God that he himself will bring about. John begins by declaring that he saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first salient question regards the nature of this new creation. The varying perspectives can be grouped into two camps, renewalists and recreationists. Renewalism has been the dominant view for most of church history. This is the view that God restores or renews the existing creation, utilizing and thus redeeming the already existing elements. Perhaps the most compelling argument renewalists make is a theological argument which suggests complete annihilation would mean that God's purposes in the first creation were actually thwarted by sin. They also appeal exegetically to verse 5, where the one seated on the throne says, "Behold, I am making all things new," which may be understood as suggesting the use of existing materials more in line with regeneration. And while these arguments, they're compelling, in my opinion, the textual considerations point to creation ex nihilo. God will make something completely new out of nothing. First, this is evident by the causal conjunction gar in verse 1. The basis for a new heaven and a new earth is that the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Renewalists must minimize, at least to some degree, the destruction brought about upon that which was. Secondly, this passing away of the old refers to an event described in chapter 20, verse 11, which suggests a complete disappearance of the old that then brings about the possibility of a new. Other evidence that this is a completely new heaven and new earth is, and not just a renewal, is that John informs the reader that the sea is no more. Obviously, oceans and seas are a critical feature of our current earth, but the geography and topography of the new heaven and earth, while sharing some similarities with what is familiar to our present existence, suggests something quite different. And this corresponds to chapter 21, verse 23 as well, in which we learn that there will be no more sun or moon. Now, continuing this discussion about the nature of the new creation, it's also important to consider its relationship to chapter 20, verses 1 to 6, which describe the millennial kingdom. It is generally accepted that John's new heaven and new earth language is influenced by Isaiah 65 and 66, which describe the restoration of Jerusalem's fortunes and foresees the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant by which all the nations are blessed. Now, if one reads only Isaiah, it might be natural to conflate the millennial kingdom with the eternal state. However, according to John's unfolding revelation narrative, the eternal state is distinct from and follows the millennial kingdom sequentially. Therefore, we should understand Isaiah as prophetic telescoping. There are key distinguishing details between these two periods, that is, the millennial kingdom and the eternal state. One significant observation is that in the New Jerusalem of Revelation 21, there is no temple. Many interpreters suggest that the temple is God's people, which we'll address in a moment with regards to New Jerusalem. At any rate, this is quite different from Ezekiel's detailed description of the temple in the millennial kingdom in chapters 40 to 48 of Ezekiel, with its vast rooms, the altar, the Lord's presence in it. And additionally, the prophetic descriptions of the millennium contain numerous references to the sea. And as has already been observed, in the new heaven and new earth, the sea is no more. Therefore, we can conclude that the millennial kingdom and the eternal state should not be conflated as the same thing. A third important interpretive question that arises from our text relates to the identity of the holy city. John describes a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven, made ready like a bride. The bridal imagery is used elsewhere in the Bible. In the Old Testament, the people of Israel are described as being in a covenantal marriage relationship with God. Then in the New Testament, the church is called the bride of Christ. Christ is frequently referred to in the Gospels as a bridegroom. The description in 21:2 of the New Jerusalem coming down as a bride adorned for her husband must be considered along with a subsequent reference in verses 9 and 10, which refers to the bride and the wife of the Lamb. Some suggest then that the New Jerusalem is a symbolic reference to the church. However, the detailed description that John gives of its gates, its dimensions, materials, and other physical characteristics all suggest that the New Jerusalem is a literal city. So it seems best to understand the reference in 21:2 to the New Jerusalem as the place where the bride dwells. This would therefore match the words of Jesus in John's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 2 and 3, that he was going to prepare a physical dwelling place for his people. In conclusion, I'd like to draw out a couple of interpretive principles that will lead to an appropriate application of this text. First, a literal interpretation should be preferred. Attempts at allegory are difficult to follow. It requires imagination and creativity to find meaning for the measuring rod with which the angel measures the city, or the spiritual significance of the city's enormous size. Those interpretive decisions become quite arbitrary. Also, if an image has spiritual or theological implications, this does not necessarily imply that the image is not an actual reality. For example, because there are 12 gates to the city, and this is symbolic of the 12 sons of Israel, it doesn't necessarily follow that there are not 12 literal gates. Second, it's important to maintain a futurist orientation in Revelation. De-emphasizing its future orientation makes the New Jerusalem a mere metaphor. It is difficult to imagine what comfort this would be to the marginalized and oppressed first century Christian community. The power of John's vision rests on the notion of its literal fulfillment. The declaration from the one sitting on the throne to write this down because these words are true seem to confirm this understanding. Putting it in writing is God's way of declaring that he will make it so. It's not a present reality that we must work towards or strive for, but something that God himself will do in accordance with his promises.